The U.S. has been through a lot in the last few centuries, and every single event has shaped the country into what it is today. The three trends that I have selected are reform, slavery and its legacies on North America, and American diversity. My name is Camryn French. I am a 14-year-old going on 15 and a ninth grader who attends Eleanor Roosevelt High School. Based on my study of U.S. history, I want to be the type of American citizen that engages in activism and fights for what's right in order to better the lives of myself and others around me, keep up with what's happening in the world around me to ensure that we maintain civil rights for all minorities, and accepts all forms of American diversity and have the ability to properly interact with anyone. Based on my study of U.S. history, I want to be the type of American citizen that engages in activism and fights for what's right in order to better the lives of myself and others around me. The Preamble and Declaration of the Knights of Labor of America discuss their stance on child labor by stating, the prohibition by law of the employment of children under 15 years of age in workshops, mines, and factories. Immigrants and rural migrants sent their kids to work because they viewed them as a part of the family economy. Wages were so low that everyone in the family was forced to work. Children were not able to get an education at school because they were too busy working like adults. The National Child Labor Committee, which was formed in 1904, gathered information and evidence of children working in harsh conditions. They took pictures to use as evidence showing what children go through in the workplace. Labor unions, like the Knights of Labor, also joined this effort because they claimed that child labor lowered wages for all workers. As a result, muckrakers, unions, and reformers all convinced nearly every state to enact legislation that banned child labor and set maximum hours for them to work. Children were now able to go to school and get an education so that they could aspire to be something. In Booker T. Washington's book, Up from Slavery, he wrote, "No race can prosper till it learns that there is as much dignity in tilling a field as in writing a poem." Booker T. Washington was an African-American educator who was born enslaved in 1856. He believed that blacks should receive a vocational education and learn how to work with their hands. At the time, only 3,880 African Americans out of 9 million went to college by 1900. Because only a few African Americans were able to go to college, he suggested that all blacks, despite intelligence, should still be able to make a good living. To support this, he taught them firsthand at Tuskegee Institution to prepare them for the economic society. In regards to the safety of the workers, the Preamble and Declaration of the Knights of Labor of America states, the recognition by incorporation of trade unions, orders, and such other associations as may be organized by the working masses to improve their condition and protect their rights. In general, most workers did not have vacations, sick leave, unemployment compensation, or reimbursements for injuries on the job. These injuries were very common because they had to work in dirty, poor ventilated factories and perform dangerous tasks. In 1882, an average of 675 workers were killed at work a week due to accidents. To try to prevent incidents like these, Uriah Stephens created the Noble Order of the Knights of Labor, which was open to all workers, regardless of race, skill level, or gender. Since they were open to all workers, they were able to help everyone as a whole rather than only one group of people. Union officers engaged in collective bargaining in order to achieve what they wanted. This trend has impacted me because without the people who did engage in reform in the past, my life would be totally different than it is today. For example, if no one decided to stand up for the minorities during the civil rights movement, then I wouldn't be considered equal today. Based on my study of U.S. history, I want to be the type of American citizen that keeps up with what's happening in the world around me to ensure that we maintain civil rights for all minorities. In Citizenship of Former Slaves, Fearful to Contemplate, Henry Ravenel wrote in regards to the future of his now former slaves, if the means which I possess of supporting the old and young are taken away, they must then necessarily look for their support to their own exertion. How they can support themselves at present, I cannot see. Once the former slaves were freed, they were in need of every standard form of living. They also wanted to reunite with separated family members and take advantage of their new rights. The majority of white Southerners were affected negatively due to the loss of their slaves. They would fall tremendously economically because many slave owners, like Henry Ravenel, had jobs to do and didn't have time to take care of their entire plantation on their own. As also said in the source, Henry Ravenel was a scientist, specifically a botanist, and put all of his focus and attention on discovering new species of fungus. Others saw this as a perfect opportunity to gain money in ways of sharecropping or putting African Americans to work for low wages. Because freed blacks or poor whites couldn't grow crops to sell or eat, they became sharecroppers. Landowners divided their land and distributed the land to each household, which included only a few acres, some tools, and seeds. Sharecroppers were only allowed to keep a small share of their crops and had to give the rest to the landowners. In January 1865, General Sherman had taken advantage of the freedmen by promising those who followed his army 40 acres of land per family and use of army miles. Of course, they were scammed and didn't receive any land. In The Ordinary Americans, U.S. History Through the Eyes of Everyday People, Charlotte Fowler described the murder of her husband when she said, "Just then I heard the report of a pistol, and they shot him down, and this little child ran back to me before I could get out and says, 'Oh, Grandma, they have killed my poor grandpappy.'" The group in charge of this crime was the KKK, or the Ku Klux Klan. Some white Southerners were angry over their loss of political power and slaves and chose to become violent. It is mentioned in the source that Wallace Fowler was a strong and open radical Republican who worked and voted with that party. The KKK and other violent groups specifically targeted people who were in support of the Civil Rights Movement in order to intimidate blacks, get rid of the radical Republican Party, and prevent them from exercising their new rights. As stated in the quote, they did not care how cruel their acts were, as long as they were able to terrorize blacks and ensure that they wouldn't vote, run for office, or engage in any form of activism. The Klan and other groups ended up killing over 20,000 men, women, and children across the South. In How Violent Was the Old West background essay, it said, "It is estimated that about 1/7 of the cowboys were black, mostly ex-slaves from Texas. There were as many as 55,000 cowboys working in the plains from 1865 to 1866. The percentage of African American cowboys was 25%. Many blacks took these jobs as cowboys to earn money, despite working 10 to 14 hours a day on a ranch and 14 or more hours on the trail. This is one example of the type of jobs that freedmen felt obligated to work due to the fact that they needed money to support their families after the war. The ages ranged from as young as 15 to as old as 40. They participated in long drives which often lasted 3 months. During this time, cowboys rode from dawn to dusk. They would sleep on the ground and bathe in rivers. Along with this, they had to interact with people such as former slave owners who still had bad feelings after losing all of their slaves. This trend has impacted me because since I am African American, the legacies of slavery will always be the foundation of me and my cultural background. Based on my study of U.S. history, I want to be the type of American citizen that accepts all forms of American diversity and have the ability to properly interact with anyone. In Living My Life, Emma Goldman wrote, "I read over the man's shoulder Frick's dictum to the workers. He would rather see them dead than concede to their demands, and he threatened to import Pinkerton detectives." Henry Frick cut wages, was cruel to his workers, and refused to engage in collective bargaining with union leaders. This resulted in the Homestead strike of many of his own workers who were tired of being treated this way. It occurred on June 29, 1892, due to the workers calling a strike. Frick still did not comply with their demands, and instead he hired guards from Pinkerton Detective Agency to go up against the strikers. 3 of these detectives were killed, along with 9 workers, simply because Frick refused to negotiate with union leaders in order to provide his workers with better lives. In the How Violent Was the Old West background essay, it says, "Taken all together, it would seem that the Old West had the ingredients for violence: unwelcome railroads and cattle drives intruding on the lands of native peoples, an abundance of young single males, bad feelings left over from the terrible Civil War, and an ethnic soup of foreign-born blacks, Hispanics, Native Americans, ex-Confederates, and Yankees. Many different people invaded the West, all from which were of different backgrounds, ethnic groups, cultures, and different in views. Because of the level of diversity, the West was specifically prone to violence occurring. An example of this was a major battle between the Native Americans and the soldiers known as Custer's Last Stand, which occurred in early June of 1876. During this time, Native Americans were losing a lot of land to miners and railroads who had invaded the West and their territory. This caused American military soldiers to take away their land and move the Indians to reservations. When Colonel Custer and his troops reached Little Bighorn River, the Native Americans were prepared for war. Within an hour, Colonel Custer and all of his troops were dead. In Chapter 3 of The Souls of Black Folks, W.E.B. Du Bois responds to Booker T. Washington's opinion by saying, "He is striving nobly to make Negro artisans, businessmen, and property owners, but it is utterly impossible, under modern competitive methods, for working men and property owners to defend their rights and exist without the right of suffrage." W.E.B. Du Bois argued that blacks cannot be businessmen and property owners without the right to vote and get people in office that will defend these rights for African Americans. The problem was that blacks weren't able to vote due to voting restrictions in the South. If they weren't able to vote, they did not have any say in regards to better opportunities for their fellow African Americans or protecting the rights they already had. Blacks were given poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses, which ultimately made it impossible to vote. W.E.B. Du Bois believed in getting social and political rights first through the use of education to obtain even more rights for African Americans. This trend has impacted me because it has proved that if you don't treat all Americans with the same level of respect, conflict occurs. Even though I already knew to treat people with respect, it has deepened my understanding with the inclusion of examples from history.